Welcome to Change It Up Radio, here with Paula Shaw. I'm really happy to have you here with me today. It's a pretty important show that we're doing today because we're talking about grief. And I think there's way too much grief in the world right now. We've had two violent events in the US. We've all been living through an international, well, I guess the very word pandemic means it's all over the globe, doesn't it? And all of these things have created loss, and loss creates grief. So today we are talking about grief. But first, welcome to Change It Up Radio. If this is your first time here, I am Paula Shaw, your host. I am also an author, a speaker, and a life transition therapist. I work with people who are going through the upheaval of change. And for us humans, that's never usually an easy road. We need change. We sometimes gravitate toward it because it gives us growth, it gives us variety. There are many cool things about change, but we hate the discomfort of the unfamiliar. And so on this show, we either try to bring on change makers who are trying to make the world a better place, or we try to bring information to you to help you cope better with change. And that's really the goal of our show today. I want to try to bring some information to you that can help you cope better with grief. And right now, I would almost bet my life that there isn't a person on the planet who isn't experiencing some kind of grief. Why do I say that? Because grief is the normal, natural response to loss. And everybody, even the children, we've all lost something during this pandemic. We've all lost life as we knew it. And that is never an easy thing to do. But before we get into talking a little more about that, if you would like to learn more about me, about my work in helping people deal with the upheaval of change, you can find that information at paulashaw.com. That's paulashaw.com. And by the way, while you're there, be sure you grab the free gift, which is entitled 20 Things to Say and Not to Say to People in Pain. That list actually was an outgrowth, or actually, this book was an outgrowth of the original list. This is my latest book. It's called Saying the Right Thing When You Don't Know What to Say. And there are so many instances when we don't show up for those conversations. We don't show up to help those people that really need us because we just don't quite know what to say. We don't want to make it worse. And we don't feel competent enough to really know the correct things to say to help people feel good or better when they're going through tough times. So that book, or start with that list, because it's literally a list of sentences of what's helpful to say, what is not helpful to say. And once you know that, it can make a huge difference in helping you to feel comfortable and able to go have those difficult conversations. Because there's a lot of pain going on out there, isn't there? I mean, good Lord, we've got people who are grieving senseless deaths that have taken place in our country this week. We've got people who don't have a home or food as a result of this pandemic, or people who've gone severely into debt. There are so many people out there that need us to be competent at those difficult conversations. So please go to paulashaw.com, get that list. And if it inspires you, if you feel like it's helpful, take the next step and go to Amazon and get the book. The other book that I'm going to be talking about today is my grief book called Grief. When Will This Pain Ever End? A lot of the information and processes that I will be sharing with you today, I've taken from that book. I wrote that book because in 2008, within a 1 month period, I lost my former husband, the father of my children, and our family dog of 16 years, all in a 1 month period. And I still had two children to take care of, though they were adult children at that time, but they were still my kids and they needed me. And so I went to work trying to use every tool I had to get through the pain of this loss so that I could get back to work and get back into my life. And about 2 months into, let's see, we lost Gary, I believe in July, Sammy in August, and this was October. So about 2 months later, I was sitting with a client and he was just sobbing. He had lost his dog. His dog had been run over before his eyes. So it was very traumatic. And I said to him, and by the way, this is a thing that's okay to say. I can't imagine what you're feeling, what you're going through, but I have some idea because I also recently lost my dog. And he looked at me rather incredulously because I was doing fine. I was in good shape. And he said to me, "Are you on meds?" And I smiled and said, "No, no, I'm not." And he said, "What did you do? How did you get there?" And those words actually are what inspired me to write Grief. When Will This Pain Ever End? Because what I did in this book was I kept the chapters short. I didn't want to overwhelm you with information, but then I gave you lots of articles and processes and tools that you could actually use to move through the grief so you don't become the grief, moving through it and coming back into the new normal that's waiting for us. That was my goal for people. That was the whole goal of writing the book. So please get that list on my website. And also if you'd like to hear past shows and you want to learn more about this radio show, you want to learn about maybe being a guest or a sponsor on this show, you can get all that information at changeitupradio.com. That's changeitupradio.com. All right, let's get into this grief thing. So we've talked a little bit already what causes it. And of course, what causes it is loss. Now, that loss isn't just death. Oftentimes, we think of grief just totally connected with death. But death is not the only thing that creates grief. Any kind of loss creates grief. So that loss could be loss of a job, loss of a home, loss of income, loss of health. There are so many things. Loss of a relationship. That's huge. That's really huge. And that could be a divorce. It could be a breakup of any sort. Moving. Even if you really want to move to the new place, moving has losses attached, doesn't it? All those familiar places, your market, your dry cleaner, your bank, all those things that you were used to finding in certain places are now changed. And we humans don't like the discomfort of change. So that produces in us feelings that often don't feel good. They can be sadness, they can be disorientation, they can be many things, sometimes even anger. So one of the things that I think is really important to remember is that there are a lot of myths about grief that we're going to talk about today. One of those myths is just keep busy. You got to keep busy, and that'll help you work right through your grief. Well, keeping busy is only delaying you from feeling what's inside. So I strongly, strongly urge people, give yourself time to feel the feelings. Give yourself time to experience the grief. Another one of those myths that's out there is it just takes time. Just hold on. When enough time has passed, you'll feel better. Well, I hate to tell you, folks, but that's absolutely untrue. Sometimes more time intensifies the loss and the feelings of grief. So, time does not heal all wounds. It takes the edge off the intensity, perhaps. But healing is conscious work. Healing means you got to get in there. You can't keep busy and keep putting off the feelings. You got to feel them. And that's not easy for people. Some people are very uncomfortable with their feelings. And we're going to be talking a little more about that in our next segment. So please stay with us. We will be right back. And we're talking about grief. Welcome back to Change It Up Radio with Paula Shaw. We're talking about grief today because there's way too much grief going on in our world, in our nation, everywhere right now. It seems that we're all being subjected to something that's creating grief. So, one of the first questions I think people often ask me is, well, what about people that can't feel their feelings or they're just not very good at expressing their feelings? They're still grieving, my friends. They're still grieving. And we do grieve differently depending on our personalities, depending on our style, depending on what we're comfortable with. So, not everybody grieves the same. We kind of think of grief as tears. We think of black dresses and shirts and jackets and all of those things that are symbolic of funerals. But grief, I guarantee you, go to the supermarket this afternoon. You're going to be seeing a bunch of grievers. If we could sit down with everybody who's there, we would find out on some level of their life they've experienced loss during this pandemic. And imagine what it's like for the families of the 6 Asian women who were killed in Atlanta, or the 10 people who just went to the grocery store in Boulder, Colorado. That's the kind of grief none of us should have to be dealing with. But one of the other myths that I really want to get into here because it's my pet peeve and I've been a grief expert since the late 90s. One of the myths that so many people buy into is that there are 5 stages of grief. And my friends, that is not accurate at all. The myth was created out of the work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who wrote about the 5 stages of death and dying. Now, I'm one of those people that just finds it hard to believe there's an absolute about everything. So I'm not even sure that it's accurate that there are 5 stages of death and dying. But denial and anger and bargaining and depression and those things that in the stages that are talked about probably were observed many times to happen to people who are in the process of dying. And so there's probably a lot more accuracy to those 5 stages in relation to death and dying than there is to grief. Why? Because grief is unique for every single person. And not only that, each grief experience is unique to each person. You may have had one experience when you had to put your dog down, but you may have a completely different experience when you lose your job, or if your husband comes home, or your wife comes home and says, I'm done. So we never can say there are absolutes that we all go through. Now, what I really do love in replacement of that are looking at the dimensions of grief. Now, dimensions are different genres of experience, and some people will have them and some people won't. So, let me go through some of those dimensions with you. Let me explain those and see if they feel appropriate to you. Oftentimes, the earliest one that we experience is shock, denial, numbness, disbelief, right? When we first find out, I watched it happen the other night, even to the newscasters, as the story was coming in about what had happened in Boulder, Colorado. Even the police people, the mayor, everybody speaking, they were still in shock. There was still all this emotion. So very often that is one of the first things that happens. Then oftentimes disorganization, confusion, searching, trying to figure out what happened, what's going on. Not necessarily these this order for everybody, however. But oftentimes there's a dimension that includes anxiety, panic, and fear. Because once we know something happened, then of course that automatic thinking comes up. Oh God, what if it happens to me? Or what if it happens again? What if it happens here? So we go into that. Here's a really interesting part of grief that not everybody I think is familiar with. Grief is a very physical experience. Grief takes energy. It takes a lot of energy. And sometimes the wear and tear on the body creates physiological symptoms. So, one of the most common is sleeplessness. Because let's remember, falling asleep is an act of surrender. We're surrendering consciousness, we're surrendering being here, being in charge, being ready to going unconscious. And so, one of the first things to go when we've experienced a shock or a trauma is difficulty with sleep. But along with that can also be other things like aches and pains, tightness in the throat or in the chest, fatigue. Oh, it's a wipeout when you're hurting. I'm sure many of you can relate to that. Digestive problems, could be nausea, could be acid, could be just a difficulty and even wanting to eat. Loss of appetite is very common. But then so is weight gain because we all grieve differently. Sensitivity to noise can be an actual occurrence. Changes in your whole pattern of doing things, disorientation can often happen. And also, oftentimes, explosive emotions. Because we all know that when, especially if life, the demands of life or our jobs or whatever are putting us in a position where we can't feel the feelings and express them in the moment they come up, then we start stuffing them down, pressing them down, waiting for a more appropriate time. And sometimes that more appropriate time doesn't come because then there's the next thing, and then there's the next thing, and the next thing. So, we, my advice to people who are going through grief is always to tell them, do your best to feel the feeling, express the feeling in the moment you're having it. But of course, there are always going to be moments in life where it's not really appropriate to burst into tears or anger or start pounding on a pillow, which is one of my favorites. And so in those moments, we have to keep it together. And the way we do that best usually is to push the feelings aside, to get them to wait for a more appropriate time for us to express them. And that can be really tricky, really tricky. Now, other dimensions that sometimes people experience are guilt and regret. And that, comes in certain situations where, and it could even be guilt or regret about, why didn't I call? I thought about calling just that day. I've experienced that in my own life. I had a cousin who committed suicide. And I remember for months after that thinking, pick up the phone. I was going to call him that afternoon. And then you haunt yourself with whether that would have made a difference. But guilt and regret often come up. Loss, emptiness, sadness, depression. This can be also another dimension of grief. I think, well, that's one most of us really relate to. And then sometimes you just reach a point of relief and release. And I know I've shared with you recently that a couple of months ago we had to say goodbye to our little Wiki, my daughter's dog of 16 years. And I think in time, this was part of what she felt because in the end, he was so ill. It was so painful watching him. She could not get a night's sleep because he had to get up several times. It was draining and debilitating for everybody. And yet your love carries you on, right? Your love helps you do what you need to do. But in the end, I think once he had this beautiful, peaceful ending that I have shared with you in another show, I think we all breathed a bit of a sigh of relief and release after we cried our tears, we talked and talked about it, we shared our feelings with each other, and we just kept this ongoing support system happening in our family because grief is not an event. It's a process, my friends. It's a process. And it's not a process that follows a timeline. So sometimes, just when you think I'm on the other side, something happens. You smell a smell, you hear a song, you see a place, and all of a sudden it's there. The feelings are there, open and raw and right as real as they were when the loss first occurred. So we need to be ready at any time to just love ourselves and accept ourselves and the feelings that are coming up in the grief that we're having. All right, we're going to take a quick break and we will be right back to continue our discussion of grief. Welcome back to Change It Up Radio with Paula Shaw. We're talking about grief today, and I think it's an appropriate topic for so many obvious reasons. So many of us are grieving right now, and we're still in the throes of a pandemic. However, we are beginning to see light at the end of the tunnel, and thank God for that because it's been a long year, a long year. So we've been looking at different dimensions of grief. We've been looking at what creates grief, and we've been looking at how each person's way of grieving is unique. So I know some people wonder, why am I still feeling so horrible 8 months later? And my friend was doing great in a week. Well, again, how we view an event, how we internalize it, how we perceive its impact on our lives, all of these things come into the mix. And all of these things affect whether we can move through the grief and go forward, or whether we're going to stay stuck there for a while. Now, one of the myths that I mentioned earlier that I really want to enlarge on a little bit is that just hang on. Time heals all wounds. That isn't so. Sometimes time makes things worse. What heals all wounds is doing the work. And that work basically comes down to feel your feelings, express your feelings, share your feelings, and then do the work. Do the work. And that work can take many, many different forms. We're going to be talking about some of those forms in just a minute or so. But it just doesn't magically get better. So do the journaling, do the alone time, do the sharing, do the therapy if necessary. You know, one of the things so many people have told me over the years, well, I thought I didn't need therapy. I thought I could just get through it. I mean, grief is a normal, natural part of life. And yes, my friends, it is. However, sometimes we definitely need professional help to get through that grief, to be able to talk comfortably enough to work through what we're feeling, to process it, to find a place to put it, to find the value in it, because we're going through a lot, aren't we? And sometimes it feels like there is no value. This is just torture. That's why I call my book Grief. When will this pain ever end? Because how many times did people say that to me in the course of their therapy? And it's a darn good question because sometimes it does feel like there's no value here. I'm wiped out. I'm tired. I just feel awful all the time. What's the value? But I think if you have experienced a serious loss in your life, and pretty much most of us have, when you look back, even though it was hell to get through, on the other side of it, you were wiser, you knew more, you were probably more compassionate and empathic, you were probably more tolerant. So there is value. There is value. I mean, I hate the idea that we have to learn through pain. And I'm sure most of you feel that way too. But we do. And sometimes when we come out on the other side of that pain, oh my goodness, things are so much better. Our lives are so much richer and so much more full of appreciation. So, in fact, here's a silly example, but I spent the weekend camping with my daughter and her dear friend Laura. And, you know, when you're cold at home, you go inside and you turn the heat on, right? You don't do that when you're camping. You put something else on, you move around, you sit by the fire, you crawl into your ice cold tent, and you pray that your down bag heats up really fast. And then you feel grateful that it did and that you're warm. But man, when I came home and I could just hop into my little bed and it was warm and it was comfy and had my nice little flannel sheets, I had a whole new appreciation of that bed. And that's kind of what happens when we go through adversity. You know, we end up much more appreciative of the good stuff in our lives. So, some of the other tools that can be very helpful when you're grieving, one of my favorites is a completion letter. You know, there are often a lot of feelings that are left unexpressed, especially in a relationship with another human. And sometimes we need to write that letter. And I encourage people to do a few things in that letter. Be sure you acknowledge the relationship and what it meant in your life. And then express any upset that you have. You don't want to carry that around with you. It doesn't help you heal. So express any upset, any things that you need to forgive them for and forgive them. Then express anything you wish that you could be forgiven for, because usually it takes two to play. And you weren't probably perfect in that relationship either. So express what you'd like to be forgiven for, and then end it with forgiveness and love and gratitude. And that can be a true healing letter. Now, one step more makes it even more powerful, and that is find a trusted someone, either a dear friend or your therapist, whoever it may be, and read the letter out loud. This is a process I learned long ago when I worked at the Grief Recovery Institute. And that letter can be magical in helping people heal, because so often it's the things left unsaid that haunt us and that keep the grief alive. It's the regrets, it's the coulda, woulda, shoulda. And the truth is, one of the major reasons we grieve is because we wish things had been different or had been better, or that we'd had more time with the person, the situation, the job, the house, whatever it was. So the more clearly we can express those things and work through the feelings, the more deeply we heal and the more quickly we will heal. So be courageous. Dig around in there, see what's actually bothering you. See the things that you regret or the things that you are still upset about, and put them in the letter. It can be very, very powerful for helping you to do that healing work. Now, there's ingratitude is one of my top 10 favorites, my top 10 favorites. So move to gratitude. Even if you can't find any gratitude about the loss situation, take gratitude walks. Just look around the neighborhood and just name for yourself all the things you're grateful for. Gratitude list, sitting right at the kitchen table while you drink your coffee. Great way to start your day. There's always something to be grateful for. In this process called conscious completion, I learned only in the last year, and I love it because that coulda, woulda, shoulda thinking keeps us from being alive in our lives in the moment. So at the end of your day, at the end of an experience, even at the end of an hour or the end of a meeting, call it complete. So you say something like, I call this day complete. I did the best I could, and so did everyone else. And so I forgive everything. We were all doing the best we could for who we were and what we know. I call this complete. You can do it. I did it at the end of the year. It was very healing. I try to remember to do it at the end of a day, and especially if there's a situation that I don't feel good about, or I feel like I let somebody down, or I didn't do my best. Dragging that through your mind for the next 2 days or 2 months or 2 years accomplishes nothing. Once you've learned from it and once you have made a concerted, um, not effort, a concerted decision to do it differently, the value is done. So don't keep dragging it around. Don't keep letting it take up real estate in your mind. You need all of your mind to be present in every moment of your life in order to live it fully. So call it complete. Say it's done. Did the best I could, and so did everyone else. And so I forgive everything. We were all doing the best we could with what we knew. I call this day complete. Love that process. Love that process. And in the next segment, normally in our last segment, we're doing rut busters these days. And last week, my daughter challenged me to reach out to someone I hadn't spoken to in quite a while. And you know what? Because I went off the grid with the girls and we had no phones that were really working, I wasn't able to do that. And so we're keeping that same challenge alive for this week. So when we come back, we'll be finishing our discussion about grief. So stay with me. In the next segment, I'm going to offer you some tools to help move you through the pain. Be right back. Welcome back to Change It Up Radio with Paula Shaw. We're talking about grief today, if you're just joining us. And if you are just joining us, I hope you'll go back and listen to the rest of the show that you missed because grief is an important topic these days. We're all going through it in one way or another. And it's so helpful to understand it. It's so helpful to know the truth about it. And it's so helpful to have tools. So, in this segment, I'm going to be sharing with you some of my favorite tools to use to help you to move through the grief. So, first of all, in the very beginning, when the shock has hit us that something's happened, whether we lost our job, we lost our mate, we lost our home, whatever it was, we lost someone to death. Usually in the beginning, the shock is so great or the emotion is so huge that one of the first things we need is some way to calm ourselves, some way to try to bring reason to the situation. And some of my favorite ways to do that are through breathing, through breath techniques. And so I want to share a few of them with you today that I really like. Oh, but before we get to the calming stuff, I do want to say this. Sometimes, if you've been really badly hurt or betrayed, or something really horrendous has happened, there may just be too much agitation for any kind of calming to take place right away. In that case, I recommend as a first step process I call the rant. And by the way, you don't have to take notes. All of these processes are in this book, Grief, When Will This Pain Ever End? So in the rant, that is exactly what it sounds like. You can do the rant at home, but you probably better forewarn the neighbors. I tend to like to do it in the car driving down the freeway. People think I'm totally insane, but what do I care? I'm never going to see them again. And I probably don't know any of them. So the rant is just letting it rip. You can swear, you can scream, you can pound on pillows, you can do whatever you need to get all that hurt, anger, and agitation out of here and out into the world. Because that kind of energy, especially when it's negative, we keep that inside, that is going to do damage. And we do not need that. So, the rant, one of my favorites and one I have used many a time. All right. So, once you've moved through that, when you're able to take some normal breaths, then one of my favorite techniques is a breath that I call the head and heart breath. And this is actually a breath I developed, and it uses two acupoints. So one is right here in the center of the sternum, and I'm blanking right now on what it is called, but I know it's on the conception meridian, and but it's about at the point where your pendant would hit if you were wearing a necklace. And the other point is on the bone on the side of the eye, and this is uh, a very powerful point. We use this point in EFT, and I believe it's for anxiety. But again, I don't have my chart right in front of me, and I'm not an acupuncturist. But for obvious reasons, I call it the head and heart breath. And all you have to do is hold these points. And remember, magic is happening just holding the points because we're always putting electrical output out from our fingers. And when you make contact with an acupoint, then it's stimulating that point. And then I just encourage you to close your eyes and breathe calmly and deeply while holding those points. And you'll feel a difference. Now, what I do suggest is try it both with the right hand at the temple and the other on the heart point, and then switch hands. Because for some people, it works better one way, and for some, the other way. So that's a great breathing technique. Here's another one. It's called square breathing. So, square breathing is just you breathe into the count of, say, four, hold for four, release for four, hold out for four. So, it's in, two, three, four, hold, two, three, four, release, two, three, four, hold out, two, three, four. And you just continue breathing in that way. And it's just magical. First of all, when we're upset, it's important to bring oxygen to the brain. And secondly, when you're counting and focusing on the counting, it just tends to be calming. There's also another breath that I love called balanced breathing. That's a little tricky to explain uh, through an audio means. So I'm going to suggest that you go to my YouTube channel, Paula Shaw Counseling, and watch the demonstration of balanced breathing because that one can work really well, really well. And it's a powerful breath. I like it very much. So, other things, excuse me, that we can do to help ourselves. I mentioned expressing feelings, talking to others, sharing those feelings with others can be very healing, really healing. Journal, journal what you're feeling, journal what you're thinking, what you're going through. It can be such a lovely way to help you sort through the immensity of the emotions that you're experiencing. So, journal. Another thing that can be really powerful is writing that letter that I mentioned in the last segment. And then I love focusing on actually consciously making lists of positive things in my life, especially when you're grieving. Sometimes you have to remind yourself what's good. You have to remind yourself what's positive. And then I think the most powerful thing of all in helping us move through loss and grief is service to others. Service to others. Find a way to help others, especially others who may be experiencing the same loss you're experiencing. And as an example, I want to talk about Sabrina Bolton, the mother of Trayvon Martin. You may remember back in 2012, Martin was a 17-year-old Black young man who was just walking down the street. He had gone to the store to get a snack and a Coke or some kind of a drink, and someone shot him and killed him. Imagine the horror that that family went through in experiencing that, the most horrible, horrible possible kind of tragedy. But once they had worked through that, and I think lots of people in the community helped them. I recently heard a very powerful podcast that Hillary Clinton did interviewing Sabrina Fulton. And one of the things that just impacted me so much, I have chills just talking about it, is that eventually they started the Trayvon Martin Foundation and they raise funds to be able to provide services They run a mother's circle and a father's circle. His father leads this circle of other men who have lost their sons or their children, and other mothers. Sabrina leads the group of the mothers so that they have a safe place to go and talk to each other and share their pain. They um, they raise money for a youth empowerment summit. I love that. They have scholarship, a scholarship program, and medical mentorship, among many other programs. So here is probably one of the darkest experiences possible, that once they allowed themselves to experience the pain and the horror and the grief, they decided that going forward for them had to include helping others, especially others who may have gone through the same kind of horror. In my mind, that's as good as it gets. And God bless you, Sabrina Fulton. I would love to one day have you on this radio show. So, my friends, we've taken that little walk through the many aspects of grief, what it is, how to deal with it, why we do it, why it's unique for everyone. And I've given you some tools here in the end to try to help you to deal with grief of your own. And one last thing I do want to say, sometimes people don't talk about their grief. There's a shame that they're experiencing. They feel that somehow they should be able to handle it, that somehow it just shouldn't be lasting this long. Throw that shame out the door. There is no shame. We are all unique and we all grieve in our own way. And the way that you can move through your grief most productively and most quickly is to just be present with it, experience it, share it, do the work, write in your journal, meditate, pray. Spiritual experiences can be so important to getting through this. So, in a quick recap, I just want to say the steps to journey through grief: feel the pain, seek support, take care of yourself, express those feelings, speak your truth, keep your thoughts as positive as possible, focusing on gratitude and acceptance, and finally, some kind of spiritual practice, whether it be prayer, meditation, whatever it is. That is a critical piece. So do something to connect yourself with higher mind every day. Thank you for being with me today. Thank you for taking this journey through grief with me. You can hear Change It Up Radio on AM 1170 and 96.1 FM. The Answer, Sunday evenings at 9 o'clock. We are on every major podcast platform. Thank you for joining us, and be sure you're back next week because we'll be looking at rut busters and we'll have a new challenge for you as well. All right, take care, everyone. Bless you. Bye bye.